I want to get into something in just a few moments. We're going to get our PowerPoints switched over here. But we've been in a series called Rediscovering the Bible, or Discovering the Bible, depending on your bent, depending on kind of where you're approaching this thing. Some of you, maybe you consider yourselves a part of the Christian faith for years and years and years. For others of you, it's kind of a recent thing, or you're just kind of exploring this, trying to discover things, asking questions about God, who is Jesus, trying to figure out what the Bible's take is on that. And so what we've been looking at is just, I would say, a healthy way of approaching the Bible. Because for a lot of us, the Bible's written in a different culture. It's distanced from us and our current events by thousands of years. And so it gets kind of confusing when you just open up the Bible and you try to figure out, well, how am I supposed to gain something from this? How do I understand what the writers were trying to convey, or what God wants me to take from this? And so in the last couple of weeks, we're looking at Bible narratives or Bible stories. Makes up over 40% of the Bible. They're these stories about people's lives. But in that, we talked about how, first of all, the writers, they're choosing very specific scenes from people's lives. They're not giving us the whole story. We want to know more about these characters, but there's a lot of questions left unanswered. And so all these scenes, they're being pieced there, not so that we can separate any one scene out and say, well, this is exactly what the Bible's telling me to do. But we have to understand it in the larger context of the story that the entire story or narrative is telling about a specific set of characters who are in a specific place. And so we got to ask some good questions. We got to think about their motives. We have to try to contemplate, what is God trying to tell me about what's good and bad and wise and unwise through the ways these characters are behaving, because it doesn't come out and tell you, and this is what you should take away from the story, and the moral of this story is, it doesn't fill in the blanks for us. We have to ponder God. We have to look for patterns. The Bible uses similar places and similar phrases throughout to try to lace them together. And so we're supposed to pick up on these things. We talked about that over the last couple of weeks and how to ask good questions when you read Bible stories. Today we're going to move on to a little different aspect of the Bible, and that is poetry. 1/3 of the places in Scripture, the different accounts that you read, are actually written in poetry. Some of these poetry items, these poems, are standalone, like you think of the book of Psalms. Each one of those Psalms is essentially a poem. Other times you'll find poems in the middle of a narrative or poems in the middle of a speech, and so there's a lot of poetry in the Bible, a lot more than what we would think. And so we're going to take a look at that this morning, because when we read poems in the Bible, we really shouldn't read them the same way that we read narratives. There's a whole different approach to it. Just like if you took a class on English poetry, they tell you about how to approach that poem. Well, the Bible's no different. And if we just assume, all I'm supposed to do is read these poems and just take what hits me in the face, and that's what I'm supposed to do with them, we're going to miss out on a wealth of information because we don't know how the writers actually structured them to be understood. So we're just going to step into that this morning. This is going to stay fairly light for those of you who could care less about literature, but it's good to be informed, because if you don't know a base level of information about it, you really won't know how to get the most out of 1/3 of the Bible, which is poetry. So we're going to take a look at how to approach that today a little bit. As we mentioned already, there's one kind of overarching story that flows throughout the entire Bible, and these poems that we read, they all are going to plug into that overall story too and give you some piece of that. That'll be more relevant maybe, or more evident if we talk about some more specific types of poetry like the Psalms maybe next week. So each poem fits into that storyline. Another thing, what are poems? Well, here's a couple basic ways to understand them. There's going to be series of short lines, and this is true for English poetry or like Japanese haiku poetry or ancient Israelite poetry. They're going to be series of short lines that have been thoughtfully crafted. And what you're getting is somebody's piece of verbal art. So you're actually looking at kind of a work of art. But poems, they condense ideas. So they're not going to use a lot of words. They're really going to make every word count to just pack these ideas down. There's going to be a lot of comparison between this image and that image. They're going to oftentimes exhibit very intense emotions. And that is so that we can read these things and we can relate, because there are times in life where we feel very intense. And the poems are trying to ignite your imagination and inspire you, not necessarily just communicate facts. If you want to communicate facts, you can write a speech or you can tell a story. But the poems, even in the Bible, they're not necessarily just to give you information, theology about who you are, who God is, or how people operate. They're trying to really pack things in, give you different ways of viewing things that are kind of hard to wrap your mind around, and also like really engage you on an emotional level and help you imagine things about yourself or about life or about God. So it's a little bit different approach when you read poetry versus just stories or speeches in the Bible. So here's a few things we'll talk about this morning, just some tips to help read Bible poetry as you go along this journey. Let's see here. Okay. First of all, ancient Hebrew poems, they're not like if you took a Shakespeare class, maybe you're forced into it, or maybe you really enjoyed it, but they're not going to look like English poetry. One of Shakespeare's things was this rhythm called iambic pentameter, where it's like, you know, you have a series of stressed and unstressed syllables. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. You're not going to get that when you look at Hebrew poetry, especially Hebrew poetry translated into English. It's not going to rhyme at the end of each line or the end of every other line. It's not going to behave like that. It's a little bit different. Here's an example, and we're going to pick on this morning, and I want you to kind of let yourself be saturated by this because I think it's a very cool poem that most of us probably have, rarely or never encountered, but it's kind of tucked away in the Psalms. It's Psalm 131. It's really short. But you can read it and you see there aren't any rhymes and it doesn't appear to have rhythm. Lord, my heart is not soaring. My eyes are not lifted. I do not go after great things that are beyond me. Instead, I've leveled and silenced some versions say soul, but it's talking about the whole package, the human being, right? Like a weaned child against its mother, my soul is a weaned child against ... Israel, wait near the Lord from now till forever. You don't see any rhythms. You don't see any rhymes. It's a little bit different. Another thing is these Hebrew poems, they tend to center around some sort of idea. And so if you look at that poem again, so I can get it to pull up here, the clicker. My heart's not soaring. My eyes, they're not lifted. So they're kind of like you get this vision of somebody who's kind of like humbled. I don't go after great things beyond me. I've leveled and silenced my being. I'm like a weaned child against its mother. What kind of theme, what kind of key idea seems to be coming across in that? What do you think? What kind of impression do you get? Like what's that kind of aimed at? Any thoughts?
Defeated.
What?
Defeated.
Defeated? Maybe because, your eyes are down, so there could be a posture of being defeated. Could be. Any other thoughts? Humbled, yeah, humility, that's kind of what I'm getting, a sense of humility. Maybe contentment even. Because you think about this child that's just like, I think about my 4-year-old. Just got done just emotionally reacting, just screaming because of something that's happened, and then he just tucks in next to my wife or myself, and just, it's like everything is like it's okay. The screaming just shuts off because he realizes it's going to be okay. So that's the kind of the idea. Those types of ideas are being communicated. And with each poem that you read, there's some kind of central idea behind it. Also, these ancient Hebrew poems, a lot of times they're going to reference narratives or stories in the Bible. And I'm going to sit down here just so that you can see above me if you're looking from down there. This is obviously Noah's Ark depicted there. But if you read some poems, you're going to think, oh, I see. This is trying to connect me with some story that I've read previously. And this is going to not be Psalm 131. This will be something else. This is Psalm 32. Sorry. I think the clicker and Gene and I were fighting for a moment back there. He's helping me out. So this is Psalm 32. It's a Psalm of David. But this theme, this imagery of Noah and the flood story and that narrative, it's like woven into this. And so I've highlighted some of it. I acknowledged my sin to you. David's at a period of like realizing I screwed up, I messed up. And that's interesting because with the flood story, you have Noah for years and years trying to get this society around him who Scripture says their hearts were only evil continually. Like they were thinking about how to harm people all the time. That was what their mind was consumed with. Like, how can I get ahead and how can I trample on these other people around me? He's trying to get them to acknowledge their failures and their need to turn back to God, and they just wouldn't. But David's saying, I see what those people failed to see. I didn't conceal my iniquity. I said, I'll confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. So I received your forgiveness. Then he says, therefore, let everyone who's faithful pray to you in a time when you may be found. And in that flood story, there were decades where God was available, where he could be found. But there was a day when the door to the ark was shut and Noah and his family were safe inside. And it was beyond, God was beyond finding in that moment. And David realizes, God could have shut me out, but he still let me find him, even though it took a while. So he's saying, let everyone find you like I did in those moments where I didn't want to listen. I wanted to do things my way, but thankfully you were patient enough with me and I found you and you made yourself visible to me. He says, when great floodwaters come, so this is like a pretty good clue that this is referencing the flood, because where else in the Bible do you read about great floodwaters? Genesis 6, 7, 8. They will not reach him. You are my hiding place. What was the ark, the boat? It was Noah and his family's hiding place, their refuge. You protect me from trouble. It was that place of protection. You surround me. Those walls surrounded Noah with joyful shouts of deliverance, and their family was delivered through that catastrophe. Okay? So a lot of these poems are going to have images and themes that will connect with different Bible stories or narratives that you've read, that you're familiar with. And when you see the poem in light of that story, it just brings out new layers of meaning. Another thing about poems, ancient Hebrew poems, the way they're organized is in couplets. So pairs of lines that relate with each other. And I'm going to go one slide ahead of this, and then I'm going to backtrack here for just a moment. So they're related pairs of lines. The first line of a couplet is going to make a statement. And the second line of a couplet is somehow going to develop it a little bit. So here's some examples from Psalm 131, one that I've been picking on, and this is the previous slide to that. I can go through this 100 times before church, and it works every time. And then in the service, the clicker just doesn't operate. So here's the pairings in this. So lines 1 and 2, Lord, my heart is not soaring, my eyes are not lifted. Those two lines are connected, they're pairs. I do not go after great things that are beyond me. There's a connection. It's like a sentence almost, right? Instead, I have leveled and silenced my entire being like a weaned child against its mother. So those are very, almost sentences completed. But the couplets operate in a few different ways. I'm going to go ahead to now. Okay, one more. Okay. So sometimes the second line, it's going to just rephrase the first line. Lord, my heart is not soaring. It's not up there. My eyes are not lifted. Has this idea of, like you said, humility or sorrow, something like that. Okay, it's going to just rephrase the idea. So if you understand that, sometimes you'll read a line and you'll think, well, I wonder what that means. And if you read the very next line, it'll just rephrase it in different words. It's like, oh, that's helpful, giving me another way to view this or understand it. Another thing that second lines might do, you can advance to the next one for me, they might complete ideas. And so, for example, with these lines that are highlighted, I do not go after great things that are beyond me. Well, in what sense don't I go after great things? Well, I try to not chase things that are too far out of my access, right? Things that I can't control or I can't change or maybe I can't know. They might complete ideas. Another thing they might do is contrast. And I had to go outside of the psalm. There wasn't one in our little example psalm in 131, so I went to Proverbs for this. It might contrast the ideas. A wise person is cautious and turns away from bad, but a fool, they cross boundaries and they're overconfident. So you see the opposite of something portrayed. And so when you understand that, it's easier to understand what the poems are trying to communicate. You can use the different lines, the second half of the couplets, or and how those are contrasting or how those are complementing to figure out more of what the writer's trying to communicate. Also, there's some patterns, and this we'll try to stay at a pretty surface level. You can get really in depth with this, but a lot of times these poems, they're not just arranged in couplets, but there's actually patterns of lines as well, and I want to illustrate that. That's probably the best way of explaining it to you this morning. They'll write in these structures. Some of them are like an X structure where you have line A, line B, line C, and then the fourth line, it kind of says the same thing that the third line, line C, says. And then the fifth line kind of says the same thing that the second line, line B, says. And then the sixth line kind of says the same thing that the first line said. And so it goes in an X pattern. And you can also get further ideas about how to understand a line if you see that type of pattern. There's other types of symmetry like lines 1, 2, and 3. Again, they reflect lines 4, 5, and 6. There's other types of patterns that I listed here. You kind of see that. If you want more information on that, it's going to be on the online version of the service. You can just kind of pause that, or I can create a handout for it in the future as well. But there's different types of patterns. Now, not every poem will exhibit all these or some of these. Sometimes it's as simple as having a line repeated. But the writer is trying to develop thought, give you a different way of viewing something, form some connections. So I just want to illustrate this with the poem that we're, again, working on today, which is Psalm 131, just how this works out. Let me go to the next slide as well. So what do we see in this poem? Well, Lord, my heart is not soaring, my eyes are not lifted. On the one hand, it's a couplet, and so it's rephrasing it. But as far as the patterning as well, there's a pattern to observe. My heart is not soaring, and I do not go after great things are actually ways of saying the same thing. And so what does it mean to not have a heart that's like soaring? It means that you're not, again, just chasing after things that are above you or inaccessible, or maybe you're not prideful. You're chasing after the things that people want to chase after to appear to be successful in life. It's like, oh, I see how that further explains it. My eyes not being lifted has to do with not being focused on things that are beyond me. And so, again, some of this isn't always visible, and you have to kind of play with it a little bit, and you may not see these things, and I may not, like I may miss things, which is why it helps to kind of discuss this with other people and say, well, do you see any of these kinds of things that would shed a little more light and meaning on this poem? You might, because, again, there are ways of kind of repeating thoughts. You can go to the next slide for me. Thanks. There's this X structure that I mentioned as well. It's called a chiasm or a chiasm technically, but it's just an X structure of lines. If you look at that line, that are beyond me, it kind of connects with now till forever. And it's hard to see this, but when you see those middle two lines that are almost exactly the same, it's like a good clue that it's either just a repeated line, or maybe it's that X structure where you've got the middle idea kind of repeated and then it goes back out. So it's like, oh, maybe I should look for that. And then you realize, instead, I've leveled and silenced my entire being. Maybe that's supposed to teach me a little bit about what it means to wait near the Lord. Like I'm just trying to level out emotionally and mentally, and I'm trying to be quiet. I'm trying to wait before God. Let my words be few. Other places in Scripture have this idea, and so maybe that's giving me an idea of that. Like a weaned child against its mother, and then it says, my entire being is a weaned child against. And it leads you to wonder, a weaned child against what? And that next line talks about waiting near the Lord, and you start to just, again, this is something where there isn't like an exact answer, here's exactly what I get from this poem, this and no more. You're kind of realizing things as you're reading through it, making connections, and other people are seeing different things, and you're kind of having a conversation, but you get the idea that, maybe on the one hand, to like calm myself and quiet myself, it's like a child with its mother. But to have my entire being like a weaned child, maybe it's not against the mother, maybe it's against the Lord in the next line. And maybe that's what it really means to wait on the Lord. And so you've got this imagery of like this child, this 2, 3, 4-year-old child who's no longer breastfed, who's kind of independent, but still very dependent on parents, just curled up, in a moment of stress or confusion or just emotional chaos, just quieted against a mom. You're like, oh, okay, this is somehow what it means to wait on God. And so the poem is teaching you things with these repeated lines, these patternings. And so it kind of talked about some of the insights that we can gain. But again, there's different patterns to look for. It's a little tricky process because it's not always clear. And I might, be wrong on some of those patterns that I see, but that's kind of what, as I look at it, I see some of those things surfacing. And so these are just things to look for as you read poems. Don't just take it at face value. Realize that it's arranged in pairs of lines, and realize that there are these patterns where certain lines are intended to connect and develop your thoughts a little bit further. They're also filled with metaphors. Metaphors, like the previous slide with the pathway that goes through the forest. We use metaphors, right? Life is like a path. It's a journey. It's like an ocean or like a wave. And these metaphors, they're concrete images. Like you can go see a wave and touch a wave. You can walk down a pathway. But they help us understand ideas that are more abstract, more mental, harder to wrap our minds around by giving us something tangible, touchable that we can compare it to. And you see this all throughout Bible poetry. And sometimes it's very helpful to have some way of communicating that gives you something you can put your hands on to imagine something like God, who you can't even see. You can't really feel God. Like you may be able to see God through circumstances at work, but how do you think of God? You almost need metaphors to understand so many of these spiritual concepts in life. And poetry is packed full of metaphors, can give you a lot more insight into these like abstract ideas that the Bible discusses that other forms of communication just really wouldn't be as good at. Let's go to the next slide here. So what metaphors do we observe in here? Again, similes are comparisons using like or as. Metaphors are taking some tangible image and comparing it to some abstract idea or concept. What kind of metaphors do we see in here? Do you see anything, first of all? Anything that's compared to something else?
Heart.
What?
The heart.
The heart? Okay, what's the heart compared to?
A bird.
Yeah, a bird. See the word soaring? What soars? Birds soar, right? Yeah. My heart's not a soaring bird. Yeah. You see anything else? Yeah.
Weaned child gives his mother.
Yeah, sure. So the weaned child and my being are kind of what's being compared, right? Because that uses the word like. So, and then the next line, it uses the metaphor, my entire being, it's not its like, my entire being is a weaned child against its mom, right? So my whole self, my emotions and my thoughts and everything, it is a weaned child. So that's a metaphor as well. We see that. Another one that's not quite so obvious, but I think is there, is this implication that the Lord is like the mom. And so we see God compared to a father a lot in Scripture. We actually see God compared to the way that a mother behaves toward a child often in Scripture as well. And so God is like a mother, a caring, consoling mother here as well. I want to give you I've used some of these videos from the Bible Project from time to time, and they have a really good one on metaphor and biblical poetry. Just gives you a little more idea of how the Bible uses metaphor. And then I just have kind of a 30-second summary and a couple of prominent metaphors in the Bible to share with you as we wrap up this morning. But this is maybe a 4 or 5 minute video just to kind of, again, give you another angle on the metaphors in Bible poetry that you might encounter.
So we're learning how to read biblical poetry, which makes up over 30% of the Bible.
Yeah, poetry is a way of writing that doesn't just communicate information. It invites us to experience ideas with our imaginations, using creative imagery, or what we would call metaphorical language.
All right, let's talk about imagery and metaphor in biblical poetry.
So some things in life are easy to understand because they're tangible, physical experiences, like being cold.
Yeah, being cold is no fun.
But other experiences aren't as concrete, like when somebody doesn't like you.
But that's no fun either.
So two very different things, but notice how your mind has linked them together without you knowing it. So when we say things like, she gave me the cold shoulder, or don't be so cold.
You could also flip it around and think of affection as warmth. It took him a while to warm up to me, or she's a warm person.
Exactly. So we take a basic concept, like warmth, and then we map it onto an abstract concept, like affection. It gives us a more imaginative way to talk about our experiences.
We're thinking in metaphors.
Yeah, they provide the framework for how our minds make sense of the world. Metaphors govern all of our thinking and language.
Like right there, metaphors govern. That's a metaphor in and of itself, saying that ideas are rulers.
Or think about a connected metaphor that competing ideas are at war.
Yeah, in a debate, I have to defend my position and provide backup so I could win the argument.
And so you can see, metaphors aren't just a fancy way of writing, they're everywhere in our language. And the metaphors we use shape our imaginations and our behavior. And so it's no surprise that the biblical poets constantly use metaphorical imagery.
Now, some metaphors in the Bible are easy to understand, like light is good and darkness is bad.
But remember, the biblical poets lived in an ancient culture, which means that some of their metaphors might seem kind of strange to us.
Like what?
Okay, so picture chaotic water like a deep, stormy ocean.
Got it.
Now, think about a time you were in danger, and then map those two onto each other, and
Danger is like chaotic waters.
right. And then the biblical authors take it further. They also talk about dangerous people as stormy waters. Like in Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters are up to my throat. I've entered the deep waters. My enemies outnumber the hairs of my head.
Oh, the enemies are dangerous waves.
Yes, and so are enemy nations. Like in Isaiah 17, woe to the nations that rage like the raging, roaring seas. Or in Psalm 89, O Lord, you rule the swelling seas. You scatter enemies with your mighty arm.
So this is a basic metaphor for danger and chaos in our world. But God has the power over chaotic waters.
Right. And this foundational image is so important, it's introduced on page 1 of the Bible.
Oh, right. The uncreated world in Genesis 1 is a dark, chaotic ocean that God brings order to.
Exactly. The image begins there and then develops throughout the rest of the Bible, and so does its opposite. If chaotic water is a fundamental image of danger, think about what dry land would represent.
Dry land would be safety, security, stability.
Exactly. Some of the most basic human desires. And that is what God's providing when the dry land appears in the opening pages of Genesis.
And this is also where God plants the Garden of Eden.
And it's no average garden. It's described with imagery of an ancient temple, high above those dangerous waters. And then from this garden temple flows a river that waters everything.
So the human ideal is to be with God in a mountain garden temple.
Yes, this image permeates biblical poetry, like when David celebrates God's presence in the temple in Psalm 65.
How blessed is the one who's satisfied with goodness in your temple. A stream of God waters the land. You still the roaring of the waves and the turmoil of the nations.
Now watch. Because the temple was associated with being close to God's presence, this high rock could become a metaphor for God himself. Like in Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer.
And that's the image Jesus is drawing on when he says that listening to him is like building your house on the rock.
Exactly. And so notice how these rich metaphors in biblical poetry are rooted in images from earlier biblical narratives. That's how metaphors work in the Bible. You need the narratives to understand the poetic images, and the images reveal deeper meaning in those narratives.
Cool. Now, the largest collection of poetry in the Bible is the Book of Psalms.
And learning how to read the book of Psalms, that's what we'll talk about next.
All right, so you get an idea, just, a couple of the basics. I want to just mention a couple of other common Bible metaphors. I mentioned light is good and dark is bad. The chaotic waters are danger and death in the Bible, and so that imagery comes up a lot. You read about storms and waves and lightning and thunder and all of that, and it's all connected. Dry land. Then he mentioned that this idea of mountain imagery, garden imagery, or a temple imagery, it's talking about different aspects of the ideal state for humanity. So like people being in right relationship with God and right relationship with people, it's compared to being on a mountain or being in a garden or being on a temple, or all three of those mixed together. And that's something that in our world, we don't talk that way, right? If we want to talk about how, like the ideal life, would you compare it to being, on a mountain? Maybe, or in a garden. But these images are very normal when you're thinking about things in the ancient Hebrew culture. Life is a journey. You'll still see a whole lot of metaphors that way in the Bible about paths or things like that. Plants are people oftentimes in the Bible. And so you'll see people described as plants, as trees or plants, or thorns or thistles. And so you get the positive and the negative connotation of that. And sometimes you'll see people described as animals too. Jesus being compared to a lamb, right? A peaceful, innocent lamb. or people being compared to wolves that are vicious, or snakes that are sneaky and sly. And so you see these types of metaphors coming out in the Bible a whole lot. And so again, I'm not trying to give you everything that you could find out if you dive into the depths of poetry from a Hebrew standpoint. But these are just some tips to think about as you read places in the Bible that are poems. How can you tell if something in the Bible is poetry? A lot of our more modern translations will actually indent the poetry and then arrange it into small, shorter lines. In Hebrew, most of these lines are 3 to 5 words in Hebrew, and in English, sometimes it's much longer because of the way that the grammar is structured in Hebrew versus in English. And so it might be 6, 7, 8, 9 words in one line for us, where it's only 3 or 4 if you're reading it in Hebrew. So it's a little bit different that way, but our translations are pretty good at indenting them and arranging them in lines to show you it's a poem. And that'll be a clue in to approach it a little bit differently. And to try to take a little bit more from it, because again, it's trying to make you imagine things. It's trying to make you feel things and experiences, not just give you the facts. And that may be something a little bit different for many of us. We're thinking of Christianity maybe more as a mental engagement or a learning process, but there's actually a lot of ways in which we need to engage our emotions and the rest of our being. And these metaphors, and these different lines and parallelism are ways of doing that. So here's a quick 30-second summary. If you can help me get to the, okay. I guess I don't have that on there. Let me give it to you on here. First of all, poems are a series of short lines that they condense ideas, they compare images, they intensify emotions so that they can ignite and inspire your imagination. So you can imagine these things and feel these things. They're constructed in couplets. Hebrew poems are pairs of related lines. There's different patterns of parallel thoughts that you can look for, and they're filled with metaphors, these concrete images that help you better understand more abstract, hard to imagine, hard to understand types of ideas. And so you'll find these things as you encounter poetry in the Bible, and just knowing that can help you know what to look for and provide different layers of meaning that you might not realize otherwise. And so next week, we're going to look at a couple of different types of poetry. We're going to look at the Psalms and how they're arranged. It's not just, a grab bag where you open up and you pick a psalm and it tells you something for today. There's actually a lot of intentionality behind that, and hopefully knowing that can help you as you use them in your life as well, to learn from them and understand them. We're going to talk about the works of Solomon as well, who wrote a lot of Proverbs. And so next week we'll look at those specific types of poetry and how to better understand that and glean things from it as well.